Well, hello again. Here's another question for the yes or no treatment. This one is, should we have zoos? Now, there are a lot of people who feel quite strongly against this, so there are some passions involved in this one. It has kind of an interesting recent background, that is in terms of the whole march of human history. Probably started up in the form that we kind of know it now during the Enlightenment. So it's a few hundred years ago. But what was going on then was that we wanted to get a lot closer to animals to study zoology. We wanted to understand the physiology of the human body by looking at animals. It was part of scientific inquiry. It was part of an era where we were seeking to come up with our own answers and do so on a scientific basis. So you can understand how the whole notion would have gotten started. And for the purposes of this discussion, I recognize that there's quite a range of what we might call zoos, all the way from the traditional zoo with the cages and so forth, like the ones that you find in big cities everywhere today, to wildlife parks, to kind of open almost unlimited parks, but ones where there's some degree of control over the animals, all the way to rescue centers where abandoned animals have been taken and protected, bred, fostered by people. There's a whole plethora of possible forms of zoos. And here I'm really talking, to make it easier to examine the arguments on it, the traditional zoo, the animal behind the bars of a cage, the sort of zoo that I grew up with, really. Okay, well, let's take a look at how this one plays out, and first of all, what the arguments for accepting zoos, for taking the position that yes, they are a good thing, we should have zoos. Well, some of the obvious arguments are, of course, that it's something to delight children, particularly in cities. It gives them a chance to see animals close up. It gives them a chance to be personally a lot closer than, for instance, they would be to a picture or to a video. It gives them an appreciation for the fact that there are other species that we should try to understand a little bit better, and what better path to understanding than proximity, than a kind of a relatively more intimate contact and relationship. So that's one of the big kind of rationales for zoos, and one of the big payoffs. There's also a big argument about conservation. By staying close to animals in captivity, we can help them survive where many would not survive in the wild and would eventually be picked off by predators and driven to extinction. And we can have a role in preventing that. There is an element here of sex, in the sense that some animals have trouble finding mates. And we've often seen this in wildlife films, and of course, when that happens, there's no progeny, and the eradication of the species starts taking place just because of the passage of time and the extent of openness of their habitats. Whereas in zoos, that isn't a problem as long as there are representatives of both sexes, and thus there is an attraction here to those who would say, well, we must keep the species going. And then finally, I guess what I would say is that zoos are held to a far higher standard than they once were. Not only are they required in most sensible places to conform to a set of rules about cleanliness and hygiene and openness and humane treatment and the like, but also, in many respects, they are much more open and kind of stretched out. The idea of the confined tiger pacing back and forth in his cage is a little bit less prevalent now than it once was. And I do remember many years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, going to the famous San Diego Zoo, where in fact we were the ones in the cage and the animals seemed to be running around freely. So the whole notion of making these arrangements for the animals a lot more pleasant for them and more humane, if we want to use that term, has been going on for quite some time. So it's not as bad as some would say, and there are clearly great benefits, especially regarding our ability to understand fellow members of the planet. Okay, so what are some of the negatives? Well, first of all, I guess the emotional impact of seeing a caged animal, an animal that in effect is enslaved, can be pretty unpleasant. You identify with that creature. You think, how would I like to be in the situation where I just couldn't go anywhere and where I was confined? And of course, the extent to which this bothers you really has to do with how big the cage is. But nonetheless, it is a cage, and that in and of itself has a kind of a nasty feeling about it. Next, in contrast to the way things were, for example, when I was a kid, we have things like YouTube and the availability of nature films on television networks like the BBC and so forth. You can almost on demand see a variety of videos and films of just about any animal that you can imagine. And for that reason alone, the rationale and justification for having a zoo starts to diminish pretty rapidly. The whole notion that we can conserve by keeping them locked up doesn't necessarily require close confinement. We can have kind of halfway houses where conservation is undertaken in semi-wildlife sort of habitats. So even that argument probably isn't a very good one. Another thought here is that in the wild there are intergenerational bonds among animals, which if we remove a member of a family, that's broken, and that has a lot of implications for passing on not only genes but understanding the education of the young and how to survive and so forth. It's a bit like a social worker removing a child from an abusive family. Even though it's good for the child, something is lost in the process. There's also a potential danger. Occasionally, a wild animal, particularly a predatory animal, escapes from an enclosure, runs wild in a town, may hurt people, and of course, sadly, what often happens is that in such situations, the animal has to be shot. Sometimes with a tranquilizer dart, but sometimes shot dead. Well, we certainly don't want any of that. And again, the very existence of zoos tends to make that a possibility. And then finally, zoos can be breeding grounds for diseases that are potentially a threat to human beings. People have been known, particularly when they got too close to an animal in an open cage, to have contracted diseases of the sort that are applicable to both animal species and human beings. So that's a risk as well. Well, there's some negative arguments. Well, I guess I have to give you my take on that. I guess what I have to say is that for all of the kind of knowledge and convenience that exists, the educational value of zoos, to me that's really overcome by the notion of confinement, of enslavement, and capture and so forth. It's just an unpleasant business. We can get all we need by way of information and even the feeling of contact with animals via video and by television. And furthermore, for those who can afford it, we can go to the areas where the wildlife are roaming free and travel around and see them. And then finally, the conservation efforts certainly can be undertaken in far more open and even semi-wild surroundings. So I guess my answer is no, we don't need them. Okay, well, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you agree with me on this because the traditional zoo is it's really, to my way of thinking, however well intentioned, it just isn't a very satisfactory place. Okay, hope you'll give me a like and subscribe and so forth, and I'll see you at the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.